Hey, welcome back to another episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week, I'm your host, Charles Max Wood, and we are talking to Garrett Diamond. Did I say that right, Garrett?
You did. You nailed it. Like
All
Simon.
right. Yeah. Do you want to tell people who you are and why you're awesome?
Oh, boy. Where do I even start? I've been doing software, I guess, for about 20 years. I started out more front-end information architecture, consulting, lots of enterprise exposure for better or worse, a little of both probably. And eventually stumbled into Ruby and Rails after just really not enjoying the .NET world. And just totally fell for Ruby and really enjoyed it. Everything I didn't like about C# and .NET, Ruby just made it so I didn't even have to think about it, and went all in on that. I built a small SaaS app, a bug and issue tracker that I ran as a sole founder for 8 years. So I was doing marketing support, design, development, front end, back end.
Oh, wow.
Database.
Which one was that?
Sifter.
I don't think I heard of that one.
It was smaller. And then in, I don't know, what was it? About 6 or so years into that, I had a surgery that the recovery went sideways, ultimately ended up leading to left below knee amputation. And then kind of anticipating all of that, I decided to sell the business and kind of focus on recovery and health and all of that. I joined my friends at Postmark to help them with kind of a hybrid marketing dev evangelism role. And did that for almost 4 years until realizing I really missed writing Ruby day to day, and then kind of went back out, went independent for a couple of years, and briefly joined up with the Egghead team as they were kind of transitioning to skill recordings, but actually just got laid off from there a little while, I don't know, a couple months ago, and have been back in kind of the independent consulting world, most likely working with the Flipper team on feature flag stuff and Flipper Cloud, and helping them kind of get that going. And then just stumbled into sharing some of my experiences with Rails generators and how I've found them to be just wildly powerful. And I feel like one of the underutilized features of Rails, and started getting more into that and sharing ways to leverage that, save time, and just kind of be more efficient and take advantage of those instead of just letting them hide away in the corners.
Yep. Very cool. Yeah, that's quite the resume you got there. And yeah, definitely have connections at some of those. John Lindquist actually lives not too far from here. And
yep. Was at his house, I guess, I don't know, probably about a year ago.
Yep. Yeah, out here. He lives in the same city I live in. So.
Oh, right on. Okay, so I was right around the corner from you.
Yeah, right in the same part of town. So, in fact, I see him at the church building sometimes. So, anyway,
small
good
world.
deal. But yeah, it is. I love doing this though, and getting to know new people. So, yeah, it's awesome, and we're not that far apart either. You know, you're over in Colorado, and I'm here in Utah.
Right. Virtually neighbors.
But yeah, something like that. But yeah, let's dive in and talk about generators. Now, I'll admit I have thought about writing generators, but I have not actually done it. Just because essentially, occasionally I'm like, oh, I'd like this to come in. So just to give an example, and then we can kind of dive in, and you can tell me how you would do this. A couple of years ago, I was working for Morgan Stanley, and my boss had come up with this method for essentially connecting stimulus controllers with Vue components in Rails. And so, and it's not really that far outside the realm of what you would normally do anyway. You know, and they tell you how to do it on the Vue components website, but we would always generate the Vue component and then add the JavaScript file. And I always thought, it'd be really nice to just have my own generator, so that I didn't always have to tell it, do the sidecar thing, and then, add the JavaScript file, and just kind of move things in that way. And then the other thing is yeah, occasionally I have to pull some other piece of something in that doesn't really fit the Rails generators that are in there. And so
Hmm.
it's like, oh yeah, I'm doing this over and over and over again. It'd be nice to have it generate that stuff. So I'm really interested in this and really interested in what we can do with it. Besides the two examples that I have, though, I'm curious. Have you seen people using custom generators in other ways?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where once you kind of absorb it, it's almost the bigger problem is when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And then you start thinking, oh, I could use a generator for this. I could use a generator for this. So the bigger problem is almost exercising discipline and, you know,
Right.
using it judiciously, because otherwise you could easily spend 2 weeks building a generator to save yourself 5
Hmm.
minutes a week. And that's not going to pay for
Right.
itself anytime soon. And so that's kind of been more of the challenge, and a lot of what I am eventually hoping to focus on with like what I'm sharing and how I'm leveraging them, to where it's really about gains, not just
Hmm.
I know how to use them, so I'm going to use them.
Right.
And my story is probably not too different from yours, where over the years there were several instances where I would sit down and be like, "This sounds perfect for a custom generator," and I'd
Hmm.
start to try it out and work on it. But because it's not, it's interesting because they are a central feature of Rails, at
Yes.
least the built-in generators are.
Hmm.
But at the same time, they aren't a like they have in my head, they are the most central feature of Rails that is not promoted, advertised, pushed.
Right.
Um, but I mean, obviously, like the original video and everything that got people excited about Rails was in large part because of the work
Hmm.
that the generators were doing. So we all know there's power there. We all use them. Even
Right.
if we don't use them religiously, we use them for models, migrations, some of the basic stuff.
Hmm.
So that was kind of how it got started. And the first few times I tried, I'd get a little bit into it and then I'd fail and just give up. And I'd go write a shell script or Ruby script or what have you, break task. Um,
Right.
but once, I don't even, oh, it was because, so my new site, I rebuilt my site and it is all built with just markdown files. And so I wanted a
Hmm.
generator to generate my blog posts in markdown files for me.
That makes sense.
And, right. Um, and it does a lot more than that too. But it's like, okay, you know what? I'm going to figure this out. Like I've been doing this long enough, and just decided I was going to figure it out no matter how much I went down the rabbit hole and it was not a
Hmm.
good ROI in terms of time spent. Um, and once I did, it all just kind of started clicking, and I see how powerful they can be with very little code, and at least in terms of code generation. And so I just kept uncovering things and uncovering things. And then once you get past the speed bumps that aren't necessarily super well documented and that kind of thing, they enable a lot of efficiencies. In particular,
Right.
when you really boil it down, a generator is almost codified documentation, right? So say
Hmm.
you have a system that uses adapters, and even if you have a parent class that drives a lot of that, there's certain
Hmm.
things you're going to, you know, redo each time you create a new adapter for a new service. And you can write all that
Right.
down in a file and expect somebody to read it, or you can just codify it and then they could just run a command and get started. Right. And none of us like the tedious copy paste, search, replace dance of like, let me go take my last adapter, copy that over to this, delete everything, run the test. Oh, I missed a spot. Now I got to go back and fix that. And then, okay, now I'm ready to go. We just want to run the generator and get to work. Um,
Right.
so, and the nice thing is too, and I haven't, like, in the questions you ask, the answer is always, I don't know, maybe the standard programming answer. It depends,
Right.
because there are several different like ways you can um, you can extend generators, you can call generators from within generators, right? So there's different options to You can change how they're configured, right? So like when we say you start a project, use RSpec instead of Minitest. Now the generators are
Right.
going to hook into RSpec and they're going to generate
Hmm.
specs instead of Minitest.
Right.
So there's all those kind of things that they can do, and a lot of it gets advanced, and some of it gets kind of intimidating and overwhelming because there are so many choices. And so what I've been trying to do is just boil it down to like remove all of the really fancy parts. They exist, they're there, they're helpful. But to me, they made generators so much more intimidating. But once I just started realizing how the basic templating works, the inflections that are available, how to concisely and efficiently set up the arguments and the options, then it just became so to make a really powerful generator with not much code. And it's also well tested on top of that because generators are important enough that they even have their own assertions and their own test cases.
Hmm.
And so there's just so much there that I feel like we've underutilized. And
Right.
so I just got excited about it and started sharing stuff and then getting more excited about it because I learned more of the little nuances and all of that. Um, so that went off on a very long tangent um, that didn't directly
Yeah, I
answer
have a
your
couple of questions
question.
there.
And so the other thing I will say, like adapters is a good example, right? Like generators
Hmm.
and adapters. But then the question is, how often do you need a new adapter? Do you really, is it
Right.
worth it to have a generator for that? Um, I think connecting things, I'll just say, so like JavaScript and partials and or presenters, that kind of thing, or um, partials and models and migrations, right? So there's disparate things that are all loosely
Hmm.
related, but they're all going to need their own files. And so that's kind of where, to me, it starts to like things scream at me, this is a generator. If there's
Right.
multiple files and multiple file types involved, then that's when you're talking a generator.
Right. Yeah, I read a book several years ago called Procrastinate on Purpose. And it talks a bit about some of the kind of automation stuff or training somebody else to do some of your stuff, right? So, because it talks about like
Mm-hmm.
automating and delegating and stuff like that. And his rule of thumb was basically if you do it like 3 to 5 times in a certain time period, I can't remember exactly what it was, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's then you start looking at automating it, and that made a lot of sense to me, right? Because if you're it's something you're going to do on a routine basis, right? So that it's basically the length of time and the number of times you're going to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's when it
Absolutely.
starts to be a productivity hack versus,
And
yeah. I mean, I've
I've
you mentioned it before, but
codified
I've
similar concepts on a maybe painfully granular level.
right.
That like when I try to describe it to people, I've started to refer to it as progressive automation. So like kind
Hmm.
of like progressive enhancement with JavaScript, right? You start with your
Right.
HTML, you layer on CSS and JavaScript, and it's still, you can stop at any point and it actually works and it's done. And so to me, I start out the first time and I just write it down as I'm doing it, like
Hmm.
really shorthand notes, like that would be useless to anybody else but me because I'm the person that did it. And then I'll repeat it a few times um,
Yeah.
and fill in some details. And then I'll start uncovering edge cases because this time is different from that time. And before I know it, I've got a simple text file that has captured my experience performing that task 5 times.
Hmm.
And so if I'm on a team, at that point, I might polish it up and share it with the team. And I say, hey, next time one of y'all has to do this, see if this helps. And then, I'm getting different perspective, buy-in, and I just gradually let things yell at me and pull me along. And so then once that happens, it might be like, okay, well, now let's actually create um, a shell script, or let's create some mini objects in the system so you can use the console and run this task real easily with some validations, what have you. And then eventually those things can then be the building blocks for a a customer service interface or even a customer
Hmm.
self-service interface, and it just progressively gets more. But you don't just the first time you know that you could automate it, but it's not worth it to automate it until it is worth it to automate it. And so I kind of forced that process to drag me along kicking and screaming to where I'm like, I can't not automate this at this point.
Yeah, I want to back up a couple of
Yeah.
steps because there are a couple of things that I was wondering about. One is, as you said, so your blog, it's written in Markdown files, and you were looking at using a generator for that. So is that in a Rails app then? Because we're talking about a Rails feature here.
It is an intentionally absurdly overbuilt personal blogging tool because I've been writing on and off for 15 plus years, and I know where I've had friction points and tried a bunch of CMSs,
Mm-hmm.
and I kind of just did it as like a hobby project. Like it's nothing that I can imagine ever dumping onto anybody else. But it uses it basically it's Markdown and a hybrid of ERB.
Right.
So that I can have little ERB helpers to generate figures, block quotes, pull
Right.
quotes,
Mm-hmm.
code samples, etc., and it will generate
Right.
semantic markdown consistently without me having to edit it. Because previously I was doing all that markup by hand, and if I needed
Mm-hmm.
to make a change that would need to be made across all of the instances, either to enhance it or to improve accessibility or whatever, it was a nightmare.
Right.
And so now with the
Mhm.
ERB helpers, and it actually is view component as well, it makes it trivial. So I just type a little bit, and then you add in like templates from RubyMine, and it just makes it trivial for me to. Well, plus the generator does a lot of that for me too. If it's images, I have an
Nice.
images directory. It'll grab all the images. It'll read through them. It'll automatically insert all the ERB for me ahead of time, so I can just sit down and write and not be bothered with flipping back and forth between the file system and the host and all that stuff.
Yep. So, going back to the original question, so is it running in Rails then?
Yes. Everything's totally all in Rails. And like I said, it's kind of overbuilt.
You just have a different engine for those.
Yeah, I meant
templates.
to imply that when I said overbuilt, to go use Rails to build my custom CMS. But a lot of that too is just, like I said, I love using Ruby. I love using Rails. And so to me, and I really actively tried to avoid building my own system. I tried a bunch of things for a while and did a lot of research.
I feel you so much right there.
It's like, I shouldn't do this. I know I shouldn't do this. I'm going to try to avoid doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, like I said, I make the things drag me along kicking and screaming. And then I'm like, you know what? I should do this. And honestly, it was kind of a leap of faith based on, like I said, 15 years of writing and knowing what I liked and didn't like and what I wanted to publish and how I wanted to publish it. Like the richer posts, like the Rails generator, like 101 type post. I never would have written that because it would have been too much of a pain for me to format all of that and present it and make it responsive and then fix bugs. And it just wouldn't have ever gotten written. And that's the type of thing I wanted to write more of. And no tool I found made it so that I could execute that in the way I wanted to.
Right.
And so it feels kind of silly, but now I've written more in the last couple months since I launched it than I had in the previous probably 6 years.
Nice.
So I think it's working so far.
Yeah. So the other question that I kind of wanted to get into, and we've already been talking for 20 minutes, is so let's say that I have this generator that I want to build, right? And you talked about over engineering your own solution for stuff, and don't build it on your own. And Top End Devs is a podcasting web course website that I built in Rails, right? Because I couldn't find anything that kind of it felt like it was more work to figure out how to plug all the different pieces together and make them look like they belong together than it did to just custom build my own thing. But what I'm finding is there are certain things that I wind up doing on a regular basis that it would be nice to have a generator for, right? Some of it's down to like permissions, right, on stuff. and just managing that stuff. Or, there are a number of other things. So if I want to build a generator, what do I do?
So I'm going to give you a tangential answer first. And this is just to reinforce
I'm getting used to those. That's fine.
That productivity thing. You don't. You really think about it ahead of time, because and a lot of what I'm trying to do, and I promise I'm going to get back and answer it. I'll just take this real brief tangent. Generators are what they are. They are capable of what they are capable of. The time to build a generator is kind of the variable, like how long it takes you to start a generator and finish it and have it working. A task, say a given task takes you 30 seconds. And if you perform that task once a week, then your ROI, meaning like the value, I could maybe spend 10 minutes on a generator and this will pay for itself in 20 weeks.
Right.
Okay. So you can't really change that 30-second task directly.
Right.
And so that's a fixed budget, if you think about it that way. So my goal is to think about how do we make it so that the creation of the generators is so little time that even small tasks that are tedious could be responsibly handled by a generator, so that you're not over investing. So that said, the nice thing is Rails has a built-in generator, and it is the most tedious part of the book that I've started writing, and I almost regret it, is I'm building, the example is a custom generator that goes beyond what Rails gives you.
Okay.
And so I'm building a generator that generates a generator, but I use the Rails custom generator, or the Rails built-in generator to generate the initial generator. You can see how it gets very circular. And,
right.
I'm working on ways around all that stuff. But so the nice thing is there's the built-in generator. It's pretty bare bones, pretty simple. It gives you mostly the files and the directory structure for your generator, but it doesn't really do much beyond that. And that's fine. I still use it. And the only real, or kind of that first initial speed bump, is that Rails doesn't explicitly document the parent class in a way that, at least not in the guides and not very much in the API, that makes it clear that you kind of have two potential parent classes to inherit from to start your generator. And the default parent class is Rails generators named base. And that inherits from Rails generators base. But named base includes a name argument, right? So that very first value, when you type Rails G model, and then the model name, that's your name. And that's there by default with named base. And so if you don't know that and don't expect it, and previously the guides didn't really address it, they've been improved a little bit. And I'm actually planning some time in the near future to circle back and apply some of what I've learned to fill in some of the API docs as well. But that can be a speed bump in and of itself. And then there's a handful of other little undocumented quirks where, unless you go dig into the source code or you really try doing a bunch of variations, you're going to hit those speed bumps. But otherwise, you generate that generator, you have a skeleton, it's a Ruby file, and any public methods you write, it will run in the order they're declared. And you'd want to think through what arguments and options you need. What information do I need to give my generator so it can do the job it needs to do? And arguments and options support a handful of types, so they conveniently handle some of the typecasting and type checking to take a command line string value and get it into an integer, a float, an array, a hash, a Boolean, what have you. And then you set up your arguments, which are your primary values, right? So like in the case of like the model generator, the name and the attributes are your primary arguments. They don't need a keyword. You just use the name, and then you list out the arguments, the types, and all of that, the index information if you want. Um, and then the options are the things where you can kind of, those are the flags, standard
Right.
dash dash word or dash letter. Um, Declare those. Those will get sucked in. You can access those. The arguments you can access directly by their name, which can lead to some conflicts if there's existing methods or inherited methods and attributes, that type of thing. The options you access in an options hash. So you can get to all of these values from either by calling them directly or calling options option key. And then within all of those methods, and I usually try to keep them really like I'll create a lot of methods that are very short and just name them very explicitly. So it's like create this file, copy this file, build this file. And the primary command there is template, and it looks in the generator's templates folder, and that's ERB. And then you have, assuming you're using named base, you have a name, and thus you get access to a whole plethora of inflections for the class names, the file names. There's even a fixture file name inflection. And so you don't even have to then, once you do have to learn them, just like anything else. But once you do learn them, like none of us go, how do I update an active record instance? What's that method called, right? Like we don't do that anymore. We just know. It becomes second nature. And so you learn, okay, template, source file, destination file, done. Or even better yet, there's a directory command that will recursively do a directory and all of the Thor template files in that directory. So one command can recreate a whole directory. And I haven't ever looked. I should look at the view component generator because I know it does a lot of heavy lifting, but I have not circled back to look at it. But I wouldn't be shocked if it, well, maybe, I don't know, that's a whole other rabbit hole. But so then you have all of these,
always.
You have all of these actions, template, and some of them provided from Thor, and some are Rails specific, right? So you can insert gems into the gem file. So I've kind of classified everything as there's things that create files, there's things that modify files, and then there's a whole grab bag of other handy things. Like you can run git commands via Ruby in the generator.
Right.
You can you can run system level commands. You can run other generators with the generate command. So you would just say generate and then the generator name and then the parameters.
I think some of the built-in ones do that.
Yes. And so there's a lot of different ways. Because
they generate a view and a test and all that stuff. Yeah.
And then they have hooks that hook into the other generators and call them. And so that stuff can definitely, it creates a lot more noise and distraction because those aren't necessarily features that the average person needs to use to automate a tedious task. And so that gets back to where my goal is to help people not get bogged down in all that generators can do, but to understand that 20% of their primary power that gives you 80% of the results so that you can very quickly build a generator. And so now you don't have to be facing a task that takes you 30 minutes every time and you do once a day. It starts to become economical for tasks that are 1 minute or 2 minute tasks that you maybe perform 3 or 4 times a week. And mind you, that's all just the building portion. Like I said, they have their own custom assertions and test cases, which make it very, very nice to test them, not even because of the assertions themselves, but because of the fact that, as Rails does, and just like with database transactions, after every test, it's clean. You have a clean working directory. You don't have to worry about, like if you write a shell script or a Ruby script that's doing file manipulation stuff and creating, you could accidentally copy it to the wrong place because you used an absolute path or a relative path in the wrong spot. And now you've got this junky file somewhere in your system. You don't even know where it went. And especially if you're manipulating the text of files, And so you run it once and then you go, okay, did it do what it did? Did it do what I needed it to do? Okay, it did. Now I need to go clean up all that cruft and start over and rerun it. And that gets to be a very manual, tedious process. And
Right.
with automated tests and Rails and generators, it just does that cleanup for you.
Hmm.
And if you get outside of what that cleanup does, it's not difficult to use the other existing things or even use file utils or what have you to build a little bit of extra stuff to
Yep.
help you with that cleanup. So to me, there's just so much power in all of those things, and it's so just kind of I mean, a lot of the conventions come from Thor, so it's weird to refer to it as Rails conventions because in this case,
Right.
it's stuff that's defined in Thor. But like the fact that it's just going to call every public method you list, and then every one of those public methods just uses some actions like template, copy file,
Hmm.
create file, um, and then there's all of the other like Rails specific utilities for the things we know and love, like manipulating our gem file, all of
Yep.
that stuff. It's there. It's just handy once you see it and
Right.
you're like, it just clicks, and all of this low level file utils stuff is just handled for you with a single method call and 2 arguments. Like, it's tough to beat.
That's awesome. So I'm wondering then, you just talk about some of the benefit here, because everything you're talking about, it just makes sense to me at
Mhm.
least, because I've seen I've seen generators do pretty much everything you're talking about, right?
Right.
Um, so I'm curious to know then, and you've talked a little bit about like with your blog and stuff, using these generators to create the blog post template and things like that. Um, I guess the next thing that I'm kind of thinking about is, um, like, where else have you seen generators used in kind of an interesting way, or where have you used it yourself that's really paid off?
Yeah, I mean, so for the most part, I would say I haven't seen generators used enough in interesting ways. I would say the most common scenario where I see generators used is in gems, right? People want to
Hmm.
provide you a more streamlined setup experience, or things like view component, right? Where they need a generator because it's basically a partial. And so you've got a partial generator. Why not have the view component generator?
Right.
And so it's mostly been those. And what I feel like the biggest opportunity is, and like that makes sense. And those get a little more complicated because of the gym, you have to handle more variations of people's Rails application.
Hmm.
But what I've gotten more excited about is enabling people to do things. I mean, I'll use the service object pattern as an example. I've started personally shying away from that more and more and more. But service objects or command objects or query objects, those are things that once you start using those and your team is comfortable with those patterns, then you kind of have a choice. You're like, okay, well, there's a lot of stuff we can do with just a parent class and inheritance, or with
Right.
composition, what have you. There's plenty that you can do that way, and generally that's what you want to reach for first. But there are going to be cases, um, and I think too, the one that I get excited about is like, even if it's just a simple service object, but I know the service object would have, okay, it's going to have results. A lot of that's going to come from the parent class, but it can also have kind of a skeleton pre-built for your tests, so that when
Hmm.
you write your object, you also already have a placeholder to write the corresponding test to verify the results of it, and that
Right.
sort of thing. Or a query object, the same kind of thing. You get into these patterns that are predictable and nice, so that the whole team knows, when I see a query object in this app, it's going to behave this way. And so you can have a generator generate the query object and generate the test file, and now you just get to work, right? So you're not switching to Finder, your file system, to copy a file or any of that kind of stuff. You run a command, it builds it, and your placeholders are in place, and you just start typing the stuff that matters. You don't even have to think about it. So a lot of it is that kind of just removing friction so that you can get to the high value work, because copying and renaming files on the file system is not high value work for any of us. And that's the way most of us just kind of default to doing it. And
Hmm.
that's just that's all focused on if you don't get sidetracked when you're switching contexts and bouncing between apps and you get sidetracked and get off on a different tangent, then that costs you even more than the 30 seconds or whatever it would cost to do the file manipulation. So to me, that's where the value starts to come in is these kind of almost overly basic opportunities so that now when a new hire comes in and they need to build a service object or a query object or whatever it is, they don't have to read a whole set of documentation to understand here's how we do things. Run the generator, and the generator already has the documentation like do this first, do this, fill in this, make sure it returns this format, and you're done. And by the way, your test, here's the exact matching spot for the test to fill in and verify the results. And that to me is where it starts to be like those almost just ridiculously simple use cases start to become economical.
Yep. Yeah, it makes sense. One other thing that I'm kind of wondering about, and I don't know if it did this through Rails application templates or if they use generators or both. But I remember way back in the day, in fact, I just looked it up and it still has a reference for a video that I made about it, but it was called Rails Composer. And so you would run Rails Composer and it would say, okay, do you want like Bootstrap or Zurb Foundation or, any number of other different visual setups, right? Do you want to use OmniAuth or Devise, which isn't really a binary choice anymore, stuff like that. But, Pundit versus CanCan. Anyway, so what I'm wondering is, would you do some of that with generators or?
You absolutely can. If you think about the built-in generators, the Rails built-in generators seem to shy away from it. I can't think of any that once you type the command and hit enter need anything from you. Thor does provide methods for interaction. Okay. They're not super fancy, like multiple choice, arrow up and down, all of that. But it provides ask and then yes and no to where, you use the command, it prompts out, they respond, and then depending on the answer, you can branch and do a little different stuff.
Okay.
And so naturally you could ultimately, and I haven't because I try to keep, again, for me, so much of it is the simpler the generator is and the faster it is to generate, the more opportunities I'm bailing myself out of tedious work that I hate doing.
Right.
And so I generally don't reach for any other libraries, but that stuff is built in. It's right there, at hand and can do some of that. But I also think as soon as you start creating a ton of branching and all of that within a generator, it's going to get tough. And that's why I think Rails has so much of the built-in stuff where you specify in your configuration, we're using RSpec, not Minitest. And that way, you don't have to tell the generator every time you run it, hey, I'm using RSpec. Because it's just one more bit of friction and steps that now you've got to answer questions every time. And I think I'm sure there's use cases for it that would be helpful. But in my experience, you want to not make people make decisions any more than they have to.
Right.
But it exists and it's there. I haven't seen it used anywhere, any of the Rails generators that I've noticed. But it's certainly available.
Cool. Yeah, I'm really just, I kind of want to just dig in now and just be like.
That's exactly what happened. I was like, I'm going to force myself to do this. And then the more I learn, the easier it becomes and the more useful it is. And it just kind of feeds off of itself. Now, my net investment right now is way negative because I've gone so far down the rabbit hole to help hopefully proliferate some awareness and reach other people and help them see the potential. But ignoring that, yeah, it's just like, oh, there's that, and there's that. It's like a candy store. It feels like once you really
Hmm.
get in there and just start, you're like, this is so easy. Why did I wait so
Yep.
long?
So one last thing that I'm going to ask is, it seems like, and I think I've seen different approaches to this more recently, is Rails engines versus Rails generators, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
I saw, I think it was an authentication option that was a generator instead of Devise, which is an engine. And
Mm-hmm.
so, I mean, it has a generator in it, right? But the idea being that, hey, we're going to just stick the authentication logic into your application, and then you can modify it however you need, as opposed to having to interact with the engine and being somewhat limited in, hey, whatever I override on the engine, I have to maintain, right? And so now I'm maintaining against somebody else's code instead
Mm-hmm.
of code that's checked into my app.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of curious, right? The same thing with like a blog or podcast, right? Rails generate podcasts, and it gives you the controllers and the
Yep.
right.
So, I mean, my initial completely boiled down answer would be that generators are really, really, really good at small bits of code,
Okay.
where small is relative. It absolutely could work for what you're talking about, but I think the biggest catch you're gonna run into is future updates, because it's basically
Right.
acknowledging out of the gate future updates are out of the question, because you're going to be going so
Mm,
far off on your own. And so
right.
in that case, the maybe the answer would be more of a hybrid solution where the core
Right. Which is kind of what
internals,
Device does.
the core, yes, right. So that's probably a great example, because they give you, and you have your views and whatever. The core internals,
Hmm.
that's inherited. It comes in from elsewhere. It can be updated. And then you can just go to town on wherever you want to draw that line,
Right.
whether
So you could
that's,
bridge the gap a little bit. Like, so if it was Rails generate podcast, just as an example,
Mhm.
not that that's anything I'm even going to do, right? Because I using CRUD and I'm putting it in the database, but
right, right.
um, just to put it out there, yeah. So then it could generate the models and the logic and the view logic and stuff like that. And so then, maybe I do have a podcast's controller that it generates instead of having in the engine, but then I have a library that's effectively build RSS feed or something like that. And
Mhm.
so if there are updates to the specification for podcasting 2.0 or iTunes or Spotify or something else, then build RSS feed, you just update the gem and that part gets updated because you don't want to fuss with it, but you can mess with the controller to make it private or this or that or whatever.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I mean, if you were spinning up, I think a lot of scenarios that make it where I haven't personally been in a long time and needed to is if you're doing consulting and you're doing the same stuff for every client,
Oh, I
then
could see that. Yeah.
there start to be more opportunities to do things like that. I mean, there's also app based, right? So you can have Rails templates and generate Rails apps that are pre-configured to your
Hmm.
specific proclivities, and
Right.
so there's always that too. But then with generators, you can do it again. Like my biggest problem is I keep coming up with ideas. I'm like, oh, I could build a gem that adds on a little bit of extra functionality for specific
Hmm.
scenarios with generators for like image manipulation. So like with my blog posts,
Right.
I dump some images in a folder. They end up on Cloudinary and all that, but like I need to optimize the size. I need to do this and that, or maybe I need
Hmm.
open graph images, and you can have it do that stuff. Haven't decided if I want to go that far, but these ideas, like the potential of what it could do, just every time I sit down, just proliferates far beyond the bandwidth I have to execute these ideas. And so it's mostly like, all right, well, what's really going to be valuable to help people bridge the gap from, I know they exist, but they're just, I've had a hard time using them, to, oh, this is
Mm-hmm.
easy, no problem, I got that.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and do kind of the wrap up stuff
Yeah.
with picks. Before we do that, if people want to learn more, contact you, how do they do that?
I mean, probably the easiest place, the most central, is just GarrettDiamond.com, which I guess in hindsight needs spelling when you say it out loud. It's Garrett with 2 R's and 2 T's and then DIMON. Although I think if you go Google or do any of the search engines for any mishmash combination of my name, I shouldn't be too difficult to find. And then that links out to everything. And I think I'm Garrett Diamond on most things if I have a presence on it. So I'm around. But yeah, my site is definitely the linchpin at this point.
Cool. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and do some picks then. Now, I never know if people know what picks are, so I'm just going to let you know it's kind of whatever you're into, right? So it could be technical, it could be non-technical. I always do a board game pick or a card game pick, as is the case today. This is a game I'm pretty sure I've picked on the show before, but it's been quite a while. And we were just hanging out at my sister-in-law's house on the 4th of July, lighting fireworks and, eating food and all that good stuff. And we played a game called The Crew, and it's a card game. And basically you have cards. Is it 1 through 9? I can't remember. I think it's 1 through 9, and then, or 2 through 9. And then you've got a trump suit, which is black, which is 1 through 4. And so then what you do is it's a regular trick taking game, but the difference is you have little tiles that go on. So there are 2 decks of cards, and the other deck of cards you shuffle, and then you pull however many cards off the top. You put the tiles on it according to whatever stage you're on, right? So different stages tell you to do different things. Some of them don't use the cards. Some of them it's like every trump card has to take a trick, or you have to take, none of the 9s, which are the highest card, can take a trick, right? And so you've got to figure out how to finagle that. But and so you're working together as a team to try and get these to go. The tiles are usually, they have to be taken in this order, right? So it could be this one has to be first, or this one has to be last, or this one has, they have to be taken, first, second, third, fourth, or these 3 cards have to be taken in order, but the last card can go anywhere in the order, right? And so the different tiles tell you different things. And then it's just a round of cards. Everybody has 9 or 10 cards. And you just play out the hand. And so it's pretty fun. Sometimes it gets a little bit tricky because you wind up with a card in front of you that says, because you hand out the cards to the different people, and so if you wind up having to take a card that's hard for you to get, right, you don't have the right cards that are high enough to, right, and so there's a communication mechanism that you can, this is my only green card, or this is my highest or lowest green card. And so then you're playing the communication game to try and let people know what they should or shouldn't do in order to get the cards. And sometimes the rule puts a restriction on that. You can't communicate, or you can only communicate these ways. And so anyway, it's really fun. I think there are like 100 different levels, right? So you start at the beginning, and there's a story that goes along with it in the book. But I mean, we always just, okay, we're playing this one now, right? And so we don't read through you fly into a cloud of dust and now you can't communicate, we don't read any of that. We just, you just can't communicate.
Yeah.
But yeah, way fun. And yeah, you hit the rounds pretty fast. I forgot to look it up on Board Game Geek to let y'all know. I'll just pull it up here real quick. The Crew has a rating of 1.97. So casual game, not very complicated. Says the ideal group of people to play is 4. But yeah, we were playing it with 5 people, and it's fine. We did find that on certain scenarios, the 5 players was harder. But anyway, fun stuff. So I'm going to
Right
pick the
on.
crew, and then just a couple of other things that I'm wanting to shout out about. So I've been talking to a bunch of people, and I'm finding a whole bunch of people that want to start podcasts about programming. Now we do podcasts, and then we put the podcast on YouTube. I'm getting more into YouTube as well. But if you're interested in that, just go to topenddevs.com/podcasting. And basically, I just want to get a feel for where people are at and what you're struggling with in how to get one started. But I am going to be putting together a podcasting boot camp for programmers. So it'll go beyond sort of the how to podcast, and we'll get into, hey, if you get a tricky code situation that you want to talk about, how do you give people an idea of what's in the code without reading it, right? Because reading code on podcasts sucks, and things like that. And so we'll talk through some of those things, how to invite people, where to find contact info, because it's different for programmers a lot of times than everybody else. You can find people's contact info the same way you find other people's, but we have other tools, right? You can get it off GitHub, for example. So, yeah, and then just how to pick the right topics and the right guests and stuff like that, right? Which is sometimes specific to your technology area. So, yeah, we'll get into all that stuff. And then I've been podcasting about programming for 16 years, and I've talked to all kinds of people in all kinds of communities. And so I'm also willing to help people get connected with the guests they want, provided that I think it'll be a good experience for the guest. And since I'm training you, I'm pretty sure I can make sure that happens. So anyway, topenddevs.com/podcasting is the place to go, and we'll get that put together as well. And then one last pick, and this is something that I've kind of just recently. So I'm fairly politically involved here in Utah, and our county party's website was having issues. And so I contacted the guy that's hosting it, and he actually gave me access to cPanel. Now, cPanel used to be this awful piece of garbage, right? But doing the things that I needed to do using it this last time, including adding an SSH key for the things that just weren't easy with it, was pretty actually not terrible. It was nice. So I'm going to pick cPanel. If you haven't used it for a while, it may be worth looking at. If you have non-technical or semi-technical people that don't want to SSH into the thing, but give them access to be able to manage it like a WordPress website, which is what I was fussing with. WordPress is not my favorite thing. But anyway, so I'm going to pick cPanel as well. Garrett, what are your picks?
Oh, man. Well, since you were doing games, I've got to say that we have been loving and simultaneously frustrated with Magic Maze, which is it's a collaborative game, but it's time based, and you can't. It's similar in terms of communication. The only way you can communicate is by passing a marker, and you can put it in front of somebody. So everybody has a subset of things they can do, which is one person can go up, one person can go down, one person can go right, one person can go left. And you've got to work the characters to a certain point and then back out. But it's all on a timer. And you could get to certain points and reset the timer. And then that lets you go. And it's an insidiously like fun but stressful game. And it progresses. So you start out simple, and then you can add in little more details that make it more complicated and more challenging as you get better at doing it.
Okay.
But the kids love it. I have very mixed feelings. In the moment, I hate it, but then afterwards, I have positive feelings about the process of playing it. So that's been a really fun one. And I was actually introduced to that while I was in Utah with the Egghead crew, and we were all playing it together
nice.
as like a team thing. And so I think it could be a fun team game around the office too, for those of us that are in offices anymore. So yeah, so on the game front, I would definitely have to say that. Um,
I'm just going to add a
and
couple of things here. It says it's 8 plus. Board game weight is 1.77. So again, real easy casual game. It says that it takes 15 minutes to play. Does that sound right to you?
the rounds, yeah, probably about that.
Okay.
Pretty quick and easy. And then, that way as you get more and more stressed out, you're like, I'm done. I can't do another round. That type of thing. So, because it gets real anxious and everybody's like, yeah, it's fun. The kids love it. That's been great.
Nice.
Trying to think if that just popped right into my head as you were talking about games.
Oh yeah, there's a ton of good stuff out there.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Trying to think if there's anything else that's just totally stood out for me lately as a super handy thing. All I've been doing is just writing. Although,
Mhm.
I will say I've given RubyMine a try on and off a bunch over the years. I've been a
Mhm.
hardcore Sublime user just because of performance and simplicity
Right.
and all of that. And so I kind of, through just serendipity, multiple people mentioning it, um, it's heavy over. There's a lot of
Mhm.
configuration, but as kind of just getting into it more and more, it's been pretty positive experience. As long as you're willing to get over the learning curve, I've been really pleasantly surprised. Being somebody with a lot of interface design background too, that always turned me off on it. Like it just felt funky. And they've recently done some refreshing, and it's been a really solid tool that I've found myself turning to more and more, and enjoying, not just tolerating, but like really appreciating some of the features and functionality in it. But it's a whole lot, kind of overwhelming.
Cool. Yeah, I've used it off and on over the years. I haven't used it lately, but anyway, well, thanks for coming. This was a ton of fun.
Yeah,
Definitely got me
likewise. Thanks for
thinking
having
about
me.
where I can use generators. So yeah,
Yeah.
we'll wrap it
Well,
up here. And until next
I'm gonna
time,
keep cranking
oh, go ahead.
stuff out about it. So
Heck yeah. All right, folks. Till next time, Max out.